Greetings, New Life. This is Pastor Jared. I'm actually sitting here with Bill Johnson, back from France and out of quarantine. And this week we want to do something a little bit different for our midweek time. We've been going through the Psalms, but we also thought it might be a good opportunity now to talk a little bit about this different context that we're in and how it is that we would perhaps apply just one verse today. Ephesians 5:16 says, redeem the time, as the old King James said, or make the best use of the time, for the days are evil, or the days are bad. They were living in difficult times there in Ephesians, in Ephesus. And so we wanted to think through, how is it that we function as Christians in this time in really two areas. Sometimes we talk about having wings and roots, or doing outreach, but also having growth. And we may be thinking, how do we do that in this time, especially in how do you do outreach? How do you love your neighbor? How do you perhaps plant seeds for evangelism, even in a time in which you're not supposed to reach out? So I thought I would ask Bill a little bit about that. How might we think about doing outreach in a time, especially right now, in which we are supposed to be having social distance? We have about 6 feet between us here, and you're mostly at home. How is it that we think about outreach at a time like this?
It's definitely a challenge, Jared. Maybe we could say this is a time for outreach without touching. But we do have limited contact with people, whether across a fence when we're out in the yard. I know Jared and I, we are both taking walks in our neighborhoods, but acknowledging the social distancing. We can still use our telephones. It's an interesting time to take stock of how many neighbors do I have a telephone number for, and the ones I can, or with work associates or other friends that I can contact by phone. It is a time when we're all in the same boat, and there'll be things to talk about for conversational starters. And then eventually we could ask somebody in such a conversation, is there any way that I can pray for you? Because I believe that God answers prayer. You don't have to go into it any further. And even if you're not able to have many of these conversations, we can still be praying for neighbors and other friends that we know who are not believers, as far as we know. It is a time to remember that any kind of effort for outreach at a time like this, witnessing for Christ should be based on relationships that we have with people. You can do a door-to-door time, but it's going to be more effective if you're looking for an opportunity to talk about God with somebody that you already have a relationship with. So this is a great time to pray and then take little baby steps towards having a little more interaction, to get to know a neighbor better, find out how they are responding in this challenging time. It is a challenge, but we can make the best use of this opportunity. It's a different time, but we have to accept the fact that it's a time that God has given us, and He surely has His purposes for this time. Mm-hmm. What would you say, Jared, as far as how we can redeem the time and give some attention to our own spiritual growth?
Well, this could be a time in which we're not able to gather for gathered worship, of course, but there's other ways in which we can have growth. We had started at the beginning of the year the reading through the Bible with a Bible plan. It's a good time to get caught up with that. Mm-hmm. We should be somewhere in Deuteronomy at this point, if we've been keeping up with that. Some people will find it a little bit easier to do, more bite-sized nuggets and something that somebody has reflected on. I would just recommend a couple. You can still order books online, or even borrow some from the church library if you want to. I can set something out for you to come pick up at some point. There's a couple of devotions I've really enjoyed reading through, and one is called Morning and Evening. It's Charles Spurgeon. It has just little snippets from his sermons, a paragraph or two on a particular passage that is helpful as something to think about through the day, as well as we've been going through the Psalms in our midweek, and one resource for that I thought was really good is the Songs of Jesus by Tim Keller. It's basically a paragraph or so on each psalm as you're reading through in a daily format, and you really understand the psalm a lot better after just a paragraph of showing kind of the outline of it and what it's talking about. It also might be a good time to read some other good Christian literature. I've always enjoyed reading biographies of first of all, missionaries. One that would be an exciting read right now is, have you ever read John Paton, The Life of John Paton?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, he was an interesting fellow. I think John Piper said that he was somebody who had moxie. He was went to be a missionary to cannibals in the South Pacific. And his autobiography is as fun as it is to read, edifying, just in terms of almost an Indiana Jones of Christian missionaries there.
And he was a Presbyterian, right?
Yeah, he was from Scotland, a time in which Scotland was sending out a lot of missionaries and going all over the world. And another one would be maybe an interesting in our context, Hiding Place, Corrie ten Boom, in which they were in almost something of a quarantine atmosphere, but they were hiding Jews from the Nazis, and just her interactions with her father, who was a devout Christian in the Netherlands, is just great. Their conversations that they had there, and kind of reminds you this is a good time for conversations with other people within your household and learning in that time.
You know, Jared, before Gail and I left France last September, we had a 5-day trip to Amsterdam and Haarlem, right next door, where the Corrie ten Boom house was located, and we actually got to do the tour of the house.
Yeah,
it is an amazing place that still kind of testifies to that whole courageous endeavor. So these are all titles that you have copies of here at the office, right?
Yeah. If you want to borrow one of these, you can let me know, and I can meet you at the door with the book if you want to pick it up, or there may be things that you want to order and get in at your home as well. They're definitely worth having around the house.
Excellent.
One other thing, though, is it might be a good time to also be learning some of spiritual disciplines that you always say, I never have enough time to do these things. I never have enough time to read, never have enough time to pray. Well, many of us will have a lot more time that we have to learn to pray. And I wondered if you could share, Bill actually invited me to a seminar that we went to before all of the quarantine things happened on prayer. And I wondered if you could share a few things that you think might be helpful from that, or some tips on just learning to pray in this time.
It is interesting when you think that we have, many of us, some extra time in our days. We can't be as busy as we usually are, and yet it still requires discipline to set aside time for prayer. So the seminar that Jared and I went to is called A Praying Life, from a ministry called See Jesus. It's led by a fellow named Paul Miller. And the beginning of the seminar, if you'll recall, Jared just took some time for the attenders of this seminar to share and to consider what our obstacles are to praying. We can have some set ways that we go about praying, but if we do that too routinely, it becomes mechanical, and we forget we're supposed to be having a conversation with our Heavenly Father. And prayer is hard work, but it should also be like a conversation, and spontaneous. Some of us have used the acronym ACTS, ACTS, to help us go through a time of prayer with adoration, confession of sin, thanksgiving, and then ending up with supplications or requests. And that can be a good thing, but in prayer, good things, it can become too mechanical. So I just want to read an amusing comment that was made in the seminar. This acronym ACTS is a shorthand for prayer that has helped many people. But we don't sit down with our wives and husbands and adore them for 5 minutes and then switch to confession, admitting something that we've done to hurt them, and then quickly move on to thanking them, and then move on to supplication and ask them to take out the trash. That would be a very mechanical conversation with our spouse. And in the same way, a prayer that is as wonderful as the Lord's Prayer, if we just pray it mechanically every day, that's not going to reflect a kind of loving, intimate conversation with our Heavenly Father. So the next part of the seminar that we attended took some time saying, so what would it look like if our praying illustrated more or corresponded to a child's conversation with his or her father? And, children, there's a little bit of fear, especially if the father administers discipline as he should. But then there's also delight in just wanting to sit on the lap of one's father when you're young. And the conversation is not scripted, it's natural, but the conversation grows as the child gets older. So, this is a good time for us to give some intentional thought to how can I grow in praying. And I think over the next weeks we can share some resources also about prayer. A good time in your conversations with fellow members of New Life, as we hope that you're giving phone calls to encourage people. I know the elders are trying to call everybody in their shepherding group, but that doesn't mean others of us shouldn't be calling each other to encourage each other. Let's just ask each other, so what's your time in prayer been like? Have you learned something new about prayer? Have you been reminded about something in your praying? A great time to share with each other what we've been learning about prayer.
Mm-hmm. And then prayer can also relate to what we were talking about earlier in outreach of praying for your neighbors. My children and I have taken some times of saying, pick a neighbor to pray for, and that gets them on their mind that they want to talk to them and they want to see how they're doing and follow up with them. And so praying for outreach opportunities with your neighbors and their requests too can be helpful in kind of tying that together.
Absolutely. I have to share a little story. When I came back from France, I had been in France for about 5 weeks, and I left just as things were really exploding in France, quicker than in the U.S. And so I went into self-quarantine for 2 weeks at home. One of the rare times when I stuck my nose out the door, I happened to see my neighbor across the street. He was working in his yard. Because I'm a talkative guy, I said, yeah, I just got back from France, and because I was in a country that had a lot of cases of the virus, I figured I should go into self-quarantine. And he looked at me and he said, well, what are you doing outside? And I said, I didn't know what to say because I was embarrassed. And he said, have you reported this to the authorities? And of course I hadn't. And he was so angry at me, he walked away in a huff, also saying, I was injured very severely, and my immune system is compromised, and he couldn't get away from me fast enough. And for the next 2 weeks, I was very put off about this neighbor, and yet because he had said this, I dutifully called the county health department and said, do you want to know about my case? And they said, well, if you don't have any symptoms, there's nothing we're going to do about it. And I didn't have symptoms. I don't have symptoms. But a few days later, I think after she read the devotional on the Lord's Prayer that some of the pastors have been sharing, she said to me, Bill, you should forgive that neighbor and you should be praying for him. Because, of course, he has reason to be afraid of catching the virus. And you were a threat to him. And so I hope you can forgive him, Bill, and I hope you're praying for him. And of course, with that reminder, I'm now trying to give some intentionality to praying for this neighbor that I was tempted to think is almost like an enemy. And may the Lord give us grace down the road to have better conversations in the future.
Yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully this has been something that's been helpful to think about prayer, to think about outreach, or ways in which we can be growing in this time. One thing, I can put a couple of links below. I know there's a few ministries out there that are putting a lot of things out there for free right now. Ligonier ministries that you can watch on your phone, or if you have some sort of a smart TV or on your computer, has put basically all of their resources online for free for a time, I think through the end of April, which are some great stuff in there if you've ever been interested to learn. They have a series on the Sermon on the Mount and things like that. But also, hope that you are in preparation. It's kind of strange to think about, but this coming up is the traditional time for Easter, or celebration of the resurrection. I'm going to have a special sermon on that from John 20. I won't tell you exactly where, so you can read the whole chapter and think, I wonder what the text is going to be for this Sunday. But just to have the entire chapter be a reflection for you on preparing to think about the resurrection and the application of it, and maybe even somebody in that chapter that missed it. So I hope this finds you well, and has given you a few things to think about in terms of redeeming the time, making the best use of the time in this time. Thank you, and God bless.